Welcome, everyone. My name is Jamal Ilyas. I am the director of the Wolf Humanities Center, which is in the wonderful position of having the honor of hosting our distinguished speaker today, Nayan Shah. I'm not going to introduce Nayan because my colleague and friend, Lisa Mitchell, she's going to do the introduction of Nayan Shah. Lisa is, in addition to being the chair of the South Asia Department, Lisa is also the topic director of the Wolf Humanities Center for this year. So again, the Wolf Humanities Center is Penn's Humanities Center. It's like the Humanities Center of the university, and we do a whole bunch of different kind of programming. We have a very active kind of professional seminar with postdocs and Penn faculty and regional faculty and doctoral students, and some of our members of that seminar are here right now. We do an undergraduate forum, essentially an undergraduate ongoing seminar as well. We do public programming like this, other kinds of programming. So all sorts of things happen. But our major programming, such as this talk, but also our seminars, and particularly our professional seminar, run on the principle of an annual topic. And there's a topic director for that, and that person again is Lisa, and the topic for this series is keywords. So this talk is in that series. So again, no further introductions to Nayan or to Lisa. I just want to say, so the talk is co-sponsored with a number of different entities at Penn. One is the Antar Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy, another the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communication, and the third, the Department of History. And before I leave, I just want to thank my colleagues in the Wolf Center who make all these things possible. So that is Sarah Varney, Erin Bailey, Pamela Horn, and Angelina Ivansberg, and Lisa Mitchell.
Thank you, Jamal, and thank you all for coming tonight. As Jamal said, this year's theme is keywords. And as we conceptualized the topic for this year, the Wolf Humanities Center is very invested in better understanding not just words themselves, but also their associated ideas and concepts and practices, and the way that they move globally, not just locally, but across different cultural contexts, across different linguistic contexts, across different political systems, and across time. And our speaker this evening, I think, offers a really exemplary illustration of the ways that ideas and concepts and practices circulate globally in his exploration and of the phenomenon of the hunger strike. So it's with great pleasure then that I introduce Nayan Shah, professor in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. Professor Shah is a historian by training, whose books uncover the complex histories of how people struggle with illness, with migration, with incarceration in the United States and across the globe from the 19th century to the present. He's the author of 3 books. His first book was published in 2001, Contagious Divides, Epidemics and Race in San Francisco's Chinatown. His second book, published in 2012, Stranger Intimacy, Contesting Race, Sexuality, and the Law in the North American West. And his most recent book, published in 2022, is entitled Refusal to Eat, A Century of Prison Hunger Strikes. His research has also appeared in numerous journals, including American Quarterly, Social Text, GLQ, Amerasia Journal, Frontiers, the Journal of Women's History, and also Clio. His articles cover a broad array of subjects, including the history of gender, sexuality and empire, pandemics and quarantine, transnational histories of science and emotions, empire and intimacy in North America, Asian American art and politics in California, the South Asian American diaspora, the history of sexuality, queer and LGBT studies, law in the American borderlands, and biopolitics and citizenship. Professor Shah also has received numerous distinguished fellowships and grants, including from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Humboldt Foundation, the Thomas J. Watson Foundation, and the Freeman Foundation. In addition to a long history of mentoring both undergrad and graduate students, he's also been featured in documentaries on Asian American history and the history of contagion and pandemics for PBS and for the History Channel. He's worked with the National Park Service, with Angel Island Foundation, the California Historical Society, and the New York Historical Society to help interpret the experiences of Asian Americans, both in the past and in the present. He also serves on the board of Los Angeles' East-West Players, the longest-running Asian American theater in the US. So you can see his interests and engagements are quite wide-ranging. His talk tonight is entitled The Paradox of Hunger Strikes. So please join me then in extending a very warm welcome to Professor Shah.
Thank you so much, Jamal and Lisa, for the introductions, for the opportunity, and to Sarah and Aaron for making the travel arrangements to make it possible for me to be here. I'm returning to the East Coast. I grew up here. I went to college at Swarthmore College. I took classes at Penn in the 80s. It was a different place then. And as you can see, I've been doing a lot of different things. So I want to bring you into this opportunity that I've been given to talk about a keyword, to talk about a concept that travels and moves, the practices associated with it. And I want to do it in a way to help illustrate, what's going on with this concept of hunger strike, what its genealogy is, how it moves from different contexts. So in order to do that, I'm going to try to move to the next slide. And but let's just start off with saying, throughout the 20th and 21st century, first in prisons, detention camps, university campuses, public squares, on boats, captives and protesters have engaged in hunger strikes. You may in fact have an image of a hunger striker. Maybe you think of Bobby Sands, and maybe you think of Alex Navalny. Maybe you think of Alice Paul, or Imran Sharmila, or Nelson Mandela, or Mahatma Gandhi. Maybe you think of a refugee in detention in Texas or Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a climate activist. You could be thinking of a variety of different people who are protesting. If we believe that humans will do anything to survive, the choice to deprive oneself of food is baffling and alarming. By refusing to eat for days, weeks, even months, the imprisoned person defies an instinctual imperative to persist, yet using one's own body is at the center of what it means to hunger strike. So the book I wrote, Refusal to Eat, grapples with what it means to go on the edge of human endurance for one's cause and conscience. But it's also doing more than that. It's trying to understand a larger process by which we want to think about what's involved in creating the context of hunger striking, but also the different ways in which people respond and how it changes different elements in our society, our politics, through different forms of communication. The word hunger strike has been usage for about a century and a half. And the concept itself has antecedents of a variety of times. As a word, as a concept, hunger strike, it was a new term coined in English. It appears sometime in the late 19th century, 1889 or so. It's used by American and British journalists to describe a type of protest that's occurring in czarist prisons, anti-monarchical protests. It sort of emerges at that time and then gets picked up over the next couple of decades by a variety of different people who are trying to make sense of protests that are happening in prison. It becomes connected to politics in the here and now, in the moment, in 1909, when it's used to describe the protests that occur when one suffragist in Britain who is imprisoned goes on hunger strike and declares it a hunger strike, and the word of that spreads. Now, what's interesting about hunger strike is that at the same time, it had many different concurrent usages that were being used sometimes interchangeably or sometimes to describe different kinds of protests. So the actual word that was used in Russian was godovka, which means famine strike or famine fast. Um, and it was an interesting kind of usage because it really just spoke to the way that they were linking the protests that were happening in prisons to prison self-starvation with the deprivation of recurrent peasant famines and hunger that was something that was both caused by natural disasters and inept and corrupt state administration of markets. There was also another term, starvation strike, that was used. This was a term that was used in Eastern Europe. It was used in labor activist contexts in the United States with the IWW. And it referred to those workers or those individuals who were striking, and they didn't have their political initiative was really about their work, their survival, and the ways in which they were being treated by the particular localities in which they were in. But starvation strike sounds, I think, different than hunger strike. And it's interesting that starvation strike becomes less and less in usage, and hunger strike becomes more and more. And there's a set of reasons for that that I've been trying to piece together, and I want to share that with you in a way. I want us to understand that it's coming from a particular idea that this word paradox of hunger and strike, the idea that it's a cessation to force concessions from an authority, exposing an adversary to material harm. It requires the cessation of the striker's eating, and it's an alarming exposure to the striker themselves to suffering. It is becoming rendered as a choice that is being made, not a condition of their existence. It comes at a time when the idea of different kinds of populations, one being liable for starvation, liable for famine, and the other being able to choose what they eat and to control what they eat and to manage their diet in a variety of ways, is coming into greater and greater stark relief across the globe. That doesn't mean that there was never a time when this kind of juxtaposition was going on, but it does mean that there's a kind of interest in trying to think about this juxtaposition in particular. And I think with a hunger strike, we're dealing also with what I would call a jiu-jitsu move, because what it's doing is also foisting responsibility on the striker's self-destruction, on the state's authority, and holding culpable the prison's power. This withdrawal from eating is wielding a last resort personal power. And the personal part is really important. It's also not seen to be, it's often rendered in terms of a personal struggle that might be collectivized, but the personal struggle is really important. I'm going to get to soon why that's significant and how that shapes in the 20th century. So prisoners are scraping a measure of sovereignty over their body at the most fundamental level. The right to eat, to choose whether or not to eat, to refuse when someone forces you to eat. By choosing a hunger strike, the prisoner takes that battle with authorities to a different plane, to one that lays bare the stakes of living and dying. Now, since we're exploring keywords, I want to point out that in the same period of time, British colonial officials were fascinated and worried and interested about what was going on in two cultures in which they had, and societies they had dominion over, in Ireland and India, about what the antecedents to a phenomena of hunger striking were. And in that regard, they looked at Gaelic language and legal texts and looked at this practice, which they interpreted as starvation for justice, which was really just coming to the door of an authority, similar to dharna in Sanskrit, which Lisa Mitchell has actually written a great deal about in her most recent book. Sanskrit is exacting justice by fasting at the doorstep, a method of seeking justice by sitting at the door of one's debtor or wrongdoer, And the fasting part is part of the process. It's not the critical part. You don't move from the doorstep, and so therefore you don't, unless someone's feeding you, you're not eating. And part of the self-destructing yourself and sitting at the doorstep is really the important part in that concept. What I'm interested in is the fact that the British authorities were trying to figure out these different forms that had earlier histories, at the same time as both nationalists in India, poets like Yeats in Ireland, were also using examples in their poetry and their writing to talk about a form of defiance. Now, not necessarily in terms of a debtor or a wrongdoer in their community or society, but in terms of how that was connecting to the state. So it's an interesting moment to think about these other usages of kinds of refusals to eat and what they might mean. You can see that a number of them have to do, some of them have to do with confinement, some of them have to do with protest, some of them are definitely around a larger question around justice. So, protest fasting. I'm going to talk about this in greater length in a moment, but I just want us to set into motion that against all of these different forms of protest, there's another form of fasting, the idea of abstinence from some food or specific time periods that stretches back from millennium. It's a spiritual practice that's connected to penitence, to purifying self-discipline. It binds individuals in different kinds of spiritual practice and community. And it's what then gets mobilized by at least two figures and many more, Gandhi and Cesar Chavez, as a way of trying to mobilize the aspects of that in terms of a protest or demand and demonstration for something else. I'm going to talk more about Gandhi later in the talk, but I want us to sort of just understand that alongside hunger striking was something that the people who are practicing of protest fast were distinguishing themselves as they're not doing hunger striking, they're doing protest fasting. And why that's important. And I think it's really important for us to understand when people sort of articulate this connection that they're particularly making with protest fasting in terms of a kind of penitent practice and in terms of a form of purification and its relationship to arguments they're also making politically and socially about how violence is erupting in their societies and what their responses to it are. So far I've been very broad in giving you like keyword concepts. You probably feel like you're sitting in the Oxford English Dictionary and I'm talking to you about it. I want to tell you a little bit for a moment as to why I am involved in this project. So in 1989, I graduated from college. Okay, so a long time ago, everyone could do the math. But I went to South Africa as part of a larger process. I was traveling in different parts of the world looking at Indian immigrant communities and religion and politics. I turned up in South Africa in February 1989. And all around me, I was there to understand and study communities, and in Durban and all around me were these words of these hunger strikes, these detainees that had been in prison for 2 months or 3 years, who were in larger and larger numbers going on hunger strike. They were starting off with 20 in one prison and then steamrolling to 300, 800. And I was in the midst of that process, and I participated in vigils, I participated in marches in Durban, and I was sort of in the midst of a moment, and I didn't understand the larger, I understood something about obviously South African history. I was there, I understood I was in anti-apartheid South Africa. I did understand that I actually belonged to a group and I needed to figure out where I was going to live, where I was going to, where I would study, where I would, what areas I could go in. But I was so struck by the lawyers, the detainee family members, the ordinary people that gathered at churches and mosques and public squares to pray, to go on short-term sympathy fasts for the hunger strikers. And in the months after the release of these 800 detainees, I heard one detainee before I left who had been on hunger strike share his story. And the part that reverberates with me was the words he said, "I have endured the worst the regime can throw at me. We will prevail. Apartheid will fail and fall." It was something that the audience, who were activists and labor organizers and just common students, were like, "You did endure. I don't imagine we could foresee at that moment in May of 1989 that apartheid would fail and fall." It seemed pretty strong, even with the release of these prisoners. That determination, though, in clear-eyed prophecy struck me on February 11th, 1990. I returned home. I was a graduate student in Chicago. The man's words just reverberated as I watched on television Nelson Mandela's walk to freedom after 27 years in prison. Nelson Mandela wasn't on hunger strike at this time, but it sort of set off a whole set of changes and transformations. I returned to South Africa 20 years later and asked questions about the signature political moment, which had wider and deeper reverberations than I was able to comprehend in '89. So I'm a history nerd, so I end up going to the archives in the University of Witwatersrand. I want to find out about the organizations I was involved in or things that were going on when I'm there in 2012. And I end up going to the main special collections, and they send me down to the basement. They said, "Oh, what you're looking for is down there." It was a bunch of boxes that were all organized of all these grassroots anti-apartheid organizations in the 1980s, many of which I knew some of the people about in Durban and sort of knew some of the people that were in Johannesburg and Cape Town, but largely just unraveling the set of networks, communications about these hunger strikes. These hunger strikes didn't occur in a vacuum. They not only occurred because there was long-standing protests that were developing among the prisoners for years, but also because there was a network around that was able to gather information of people that were in secretive detention, get that information out, circulate it, develop different kinds of protests. So that became the process I became most interested in, understanding how this process occurred. And therefore, when I ended up going backward in time and forward in time, looking to the early period of hunger strikes and to the more current ones, I wanted to explore what it takes to resist and oppose state power within the precincts of the prison, and then the broadcasting of that opposition beyond its walls through this unique tool of hunger striking. And I want to emphasize that it's very rare, and you saw photographs before, you never see a hunger striker in prison. You see them if they've been removed to the hospital, if they've been put in some other location after the hunger strike. You see many people rallying for hunger strikers. You see people protesting outside in public and claiming that they're hunger striking, maybe in solidarity with these prisoners. But the process by which we can imagine what it means to struggle in a prison for people we probably don't know, and what it means to have some sort of visceral feeling about what that might be happening there. That's actually something about the forms that hunger striking takes. And this is kind of a classic humanities move, right? Let's pay attention to the forms that people communicate. And you can think about it. How do you, what reaches you with something that's written in text, with someone speaking about it, and sharing a story, with something that you see on a TikTok video. These are all different ways in which the forms are changing in relationship to the meanings and concept of what a hunger strike is and why it's being done. Why it's purposeful as well as emotional, why it's visceral as well as reasoned. And so the project itself began to sort of then take the form of looking at least three themes, and there are more, but I'll only provide you three here. Crisis of democracy and government accountability as one, the growth of prison power in the 20th and 21st century, and communicating bodily defiance. So I'm going to share a little bit here about how we might want to think about these concepts and lenses to understand different kinds of situations over the course of 125 years. So the crisis of democracy. I've been struck with how the arena of what's invariably at stake in a hunger strike is a demand for justice, equity, fair outcomes that the state has so far refused to concede. The contest that's occurring is about government action or inaction. And in terms of both the conditions within a prison and also what is occurring outside of it. There's a move back and forth. The contest is over prison power and bodily defiance that erupts out of this democracy and government accountability challenge. At the core of this is a demand for political voice and participation in governing society. And that, I think, is at the core of so many of these different struggles that people are articulating using this form, this way of protesting, hunger striking, and then articulating its different forms. So the crisis of democracy is really also enabled by this, both this idea that the rights of some are being upheld and the others are being consigned to rightlessness. And very much the idea of unheard grievances and denied rights are spawning protests both in the streets and in public. And there are a couple of trajectories around this. One is democratic inclusion, democratizing what I call the imperial state, the US, Britain at this time. There are other examples of France and other nations as well, demanding inclusion to vote, to speak, to assemble, to agitate. And then arguments about independence, self-governance, anti-colonial rebellion, liberating the sovereignty of the individual body as a metaphor for political rule as well. At the same time as we're having this process, there's this rise of criminalization that governments are involved in imprisoning and criminalizing political opponents and discrediting their protests. The very idea of political prisoner is invented as a concept that comes out in the mid-19th, late 19th century, out of the idea that you take your political opponents and you put them in prison. You find ways of moving them into that regime, and you recognize them as well as being politically involved, even though they might have been involved in other forms of, say, sabotage or, have been assembling in unauthorized ways or the like. And this sort of continues to grow in the 20th century. So at first, Britain is like, oh, the people that are doing this bad thing are over there in Germany or they're over there in Russia. And then they discover that they're actually over there in Britain, where the British themselves, both supporting an idea of democratic society, the rights to assemble and speak and communicate, are actually being held and challenged by suffrage activists, people who are fighting for political for labor changes and transformations in their work, out and out rebellions in Ireland, and that also impact Britain itself in India in the 1920s and 30s. And over time, we also see this growth of prison power as the use of prisons in different kinds of forms. Detention camps, concentration camps, different kinds of camps for migrants are being proliferated as well as jails and asylums and like are. So we see this kind of process going on, and this larger process is really then challenging this idea of how do you communicate bodily defiance. What's pivotal is this communication carries between what's in the sequestered in prison over the threshold to the outside world. As Nelson Mandela said, the world, told the world of his fears 3 decades after he went on hunger strike, the 1966 hunger strike on Robben Island. He said, in order for hunger strikers to succeed, the outside world must learn of it. Otherwise, prisoners will simply starve themselves to death, and no one will know. Now, communication is not always immediate. In fact, Mandela and hundreds of prisoners on Robben Island in 1966 didn't really reveal their struggles until their biographies and memoirs came out 20 years, 30 years later in the 1980s and 90s. Prisoners fear that the news of that hunger strike will not escape the confines of the prison. But I also think that what's important is that there's bodily defiance that's happening in the prison. It's upsetting what's happening in the prison, the actual active regard. So these forms of bodily defiance are impacting the prison guards, the physicians and nurses and orderlies that are called in. They're affecting politicians. News is leaking in a variety of different ways, and trying to figure out how to handle the hunger striker becomes a really important problem. This even in prisons where prisoner deaths are often excused by a variety of different means. Oh, this person committed suicide. Oh, they were in a fight. Something went wrong. But hunger striking seems to have a different kind of power and reach to people's experience of, is that what causes their death? And who's responsible for that? So I'm just going to give you a little bit about, this was the first part of the book around these contests around imperial democracy. And you can see I focus in on suffragists, both American and British. And I look at Irish Republican and Gandhi's fasts in India in relationship to hunger strikes that are happening in India, as well as look at forcible feeding. I'm not going to talk about forcible feeding in this talk. I'm not happy to. I will talk about it if you want, but I often find that forcible feeding, which is the weapon of the state or authority on the hunger striker, is the actual weapon saying, you're diagnosed with hunger striking, here, we will wait until you're ready, and then we will feed you. That becomes the thing that eclipses everything. And I've learned that over time, and I also feel like it takes away from some of the other elements of the work. So with that proviso, let me just say that I think it's important for us to understand in the early setting stages of why hunger striking is this kind of this performance around the body, why it actually has this kind of power and reach, what the communication is of it, and how does it relate to democracy. So in order to do so, we go back to the history of women's rights and suffrage, and we have to look at like Marion Wallace Dunlop, who's a person who fasts for 91 hours, not long, in London's Holloway prison. She's recognized by her political statement made to the press after her release, and by her own articulation through different kinds of ways in which she communicates in the British suffrage movement, that her arrest and imprisonment because of her persistent petitioning of Parliament that was refused and rebuffed, and that's why she was arrested. She was in the wrong place of Parliament, trying to have her petition read by members of Parliament. She went to a section of it that she wasn't supposed to be in. She put on the wall, she stamped on the wall her words about her desire to be petitioned, to petition for suffrage to be taken up as an issue for Parliament. It's that process of not having her words heard, understood, read, or responded to that she talks about her bodily refusal. And she talks about how she chose a hunger strike in order to refuse what the prison was offering and to also upset what was going on in the prison in terms of her confinement. And the prison authorities release her. They do this form of release in the first several weeks after other women also take on hunger strikes. But the New Age British magazine writes and calls the protest itself a masterpiece of ingenuity and tenacity. The public understands hunger. Within a month, George Bernard Shaw, the playwright, reportedly wrote that her actions had struck a chord which will vibrate to the end of time. Both assessments emphasize the refusal to eat was a different kind of communicative power, a visceral one, that could vibrate across time and space and be grasped by the public. But the British suffragists are experimenting. And I think it's really important for us to understand that. We might have an idea of hunger striking as being one particular thing. You say, I'm going to do it, and then you do it for as long as you can, for a long duration. And what I think was really interesting about understanding what's going on in the British prisons is that women are picking up on hunger striking that have been arrested for their protests around suffrage, about their protests, which are they're really riled up. They're doing all kinds of sabotage and they're breaking windows. They're definitely disrupting the public and disrupting society. And they are, for the next 4.5 years, they will be engaged in different strikes that are short term, sometimes 48 hours, sometimes relay strikes between different women. Sometimes some go for 96 hours, sometimes people stop, they start again. They're all doing this in terms of grabbing a kind of power between themselves and prison authorities. They're shifting the authorities' attention, their resources, their treatment of prisoners. They're taking something that they experienced as prisoners, food deprivation and control, onto themselves. And it's a durational protest. It's only possible because new prisoners started and are determined to overcome the body's signals of hunger and to withstand the pressures of authorities, guards, fellow prisoners, family members, physicians, to resume eating. As scholar Diana Taylor says, the witnessing and sharing after the striker's trauma is, quote, a tool and a political project that challenges listeners to respond and to actively reckon with injustice, to summon a call to raise awareness, to change a policy, to enact reparations. Oppositional political groups feature these singular voices on their own in the media. What's important about why we know not only about Marianne Wallace Dunlop, but also about Constance Lighton, about many other women who wrote out their testimonials, is it's a communication strategy that's being used by suffrage organizers. They're using this idea of tell your personal story. What is your experience in prison? What are the conditions you are facing? What are your doubts? What are your fears? Articulating that also in a way that allows you to hold on to an idea of here's my dignity, here's my reason, and here is how I am struggling with moments of isolation and suffering, and showing you my courage, my endurance, my righteousness. So this strategy is one that develops out of these hunger strikes when people, when they're released from prison, end up going to the offices of the suffrage organizations, and someone types up their testimony, and then that circulates in a variety of different ways. It circulates at protest marches, it circulates as press releases, it circulates in their own publications. It circulates in books about prison and prison life that are happening. And it's marshaling all those resources, but with an audience that they're able to figure out some way of making that audience potentially sympathetic. So I want to give a contrast. In 1909, at the same time as Alice Paul, who grew up in New Jersey, went to Swarthmore, spent some time here at Penn, in fact, and decided, her experience of continuing education in England was to actually engage in the suffrage movement, to fight for women's suffrage, and she went on hunger strike in November 1909 as a student, as an American student, from an elite family where it mattered that apparently the Philadelphia papers and New Jersey and New York Times wrote about her hunger strike at the same time as the leader of the British suffrage movement, Pankhurst, was touring in the United States. At the same time that's happening, there's a starvation strike, so-called, in Spokane. And it's a strike of IWW workers who are not allowed to assemble. It's a free speech fight. They're being told by all the people that are in Spokane that the power, the economic powers, the political powers that they don't, as members of the IWW, as rallying for speech about agitating about their labor conditions or their wages or who to actually trust, they aren't going to actually be allowed to speak. So many of them are, they go out to these soapboxes and they're corralled into these makeshift prisons, including Agnes Fair, who experiences and writes about her own experiences of assault that occurs from male prisoners and guards in the prisons. She continues to struggle for the right to speak, the right to organize. But she is someone who is being ridiculed by the mainstream press. And it's only the leftist press is picking her up, and the pro-worker press, but it's also being quite suppressed. So in that moment, she's not experiencing a wider spread, like, what is she doing? Why is she doing it? Kind of articulation that is different than what the suffragists are also kind of struggling with. They're struggling with this too. They're being doubted. They're being thought about as women who, in Britain and in the United States, as women who should not be engaged in this form of struggle. It's unseemly, it's unwomanly. But they are able to also articulate a sense of the possibility of seeing themselves, and some of them are middle-class women who are able to sort of speak about their literacy, their standing, the expectation that they should be respected or concerned about or cared for. That they may have, people might argue and debate how they were being treated or whether they deserved it, but they themselves are finding ways of challenging that conversation. Moving on to other ways in which the struggle is going on. By the way, suffrage takes a long time to enact. We often think like these processes happen in Britain. These fights went on well through 1914. 1914 is a hiatus because of World War I. It's only after 1918 and eventually 1928 that all women are given the right to vote in Britain and the United States. Similarly, struggles go on for decades, and it's in that sort of aftermath of 1919 that we have this shift and change that occurs on the federal level. This has been occurring on state levels. But here, I wanted to sort of change the sort of register here. Anti-colonial rebellion is one of the arenas in which I want us to think about. And it's hunger strikes occurred in Ireland. Irish Republicans were engaged in hunger strikes when they were imprisoned in the 19-teens in their rebellions against British rule. During the War of Independence in Ireland, the political specter of hunger striking martyrs and funeral processions were heightened in this ordeal of Terence McSweeney, who was an Irish poet, a playwright, a Republican leader. He went on hunger strike in 1920. He was arrested for sedition along with a dozen other men. He was summarily sentenced to 2 years imprisonment in a military court, but he was also Lord Mayor of Cork, which was a ceremonial position, but the British separated him from the others in Cork and brought him to London. They brought him to Brixton Prison. His sisters, his wife, his Catholic confessor followed him to London. In London, his eldest sister, Mary McSweeney, a former schoolteacher and political leader, worked with Art O'Brien, editor of the Irish Self-Determination League's paper, Irish Exile, to carefully choreograph the news coverage and protests in support of McSweeney. They held daily briefings with the international press. They really amplified his vow to hunger strike to the death and put it on a world stage. London, where all the press services were, sent wires across the globe publicizing the weeks before he died and his prophetic words. Because he was a poet and a writer, his own words were often redeployed to speak to the current moment. Support rallied from British and international labor movements, Catholics worldwide, Irish Catholics living in Australia, the United States. What was innovative were these diasporic networks were doing something to continue this idea of procession that occurs for him at his death. And this procession was also preceded by these vigils and that occur both before and after. So large-scale gatherings are happening for and about Terence McSweeney, one around his death and the sort of way in which his body is being transported from Brixton Prison to Southwark Cathedral, which is across the street from British Parliament, across the river rather. What's happening in terms of an international process as people are learning about this process of Vigil, the idea that he's both being considered simultaneously as a Irish nationalist and as a Catholic martyr. And it's being responded to by a range of different people from Boston to Chicago, Barcelona, Melbourne, as well as throughout Ireland and in England itself. There's a fascination and concern that's developed here that also does the work in posthumously when his writings are published, Principles of Freedom. They sort of show a long reach of McSweeney's political influence in anti-colonial rebellions. So the connection of anti-colonial rebellion and hunger strike is really echoed in this kind of way in which McSweeney speaks of this work. And what's so striking to me is how many other hands it takes. So it's not only beyond the Irish diaspora and Catholicism generally, but it also gets picked up by Marcus Garvey and a young Ho Chi Minh who's working as a cook in Paris. And Gandhi speaks of McSweeney's bravery and sacrifice. They're repurposing the hunger strike that's very particularly contextualized in one space into a geopolitical sign of an anti-colonial bodily sacrifice and moral defiance. So I promised you I'd return to Gandhi, and I want us to understand that Gandhi is involved in what he calls a satyagraha fast. It's a public protest fast for sure. It becomes his signature tool of nonviolent civil disobedience. He can do something like make commentary on McSweeney and also on Indian prisoners in India who are going on hunger strike at the same time. But Gandhi goes on 17 long-term fasts. First in South Africa in 1913, the last in Delhi in January 48 before he's assassinated. He was mostly done outside of prison by his own doctors, care systems, often with a fixed duration, which he would claim from the onset, 3 days, 21 days, 5 days. With the protest fast that he's doing, what he's doing is he's enlarging on a spiritual fast. He's recasting its purpose as a way of talking about spiritual self-discipline and rousing his followers' ethical consciousness to forsake violence for political independence. Gandhi's involved in taking a penitent practice, picking up from influences in Hindu, Jain, and Muslim traditions familiar to the people of India. And for him, fasting was something about a process. It was about clarifying the truth. He often would not articulate it as a political weapon, but as a bodily epistemology, a way of knowing and perceiving in something about his own spirit and the conditions around him. So that's why he would use satyagraha as his way of talking about truth force, slow force, love force, which he felt was his contribution, and the fast was part of that process. And he fasted for different causes, against violent protests, actions of radical factions of the independence movement, in support of Harijans, untouchables, in opposition to British constitutional proposals to create a separation based on caste or based on religion, for Hindu-Muslim unity, against communal riots. He didn't fast very often against the British. He fasted against these conditions that he wanted to see ended. He considered fasting a persuasive and personal strategy of communication to his followers. He saw it as a way of using his own experience metaphorically and practically as a mode of revelation and visionary experience that Gandhi experienced, and he wanted to share that with people. So satyagraha fasting meant that he really used that as a way of directly connecting to thousands of people who were his passionate followers, supporters, to fellow satyagrahis, also to people who disagreed with him, who thought he was mad or crazy or politically inopportune for stopping a political movement to fast, and to get people to calm down and to refuse to use violence. He would say that you can't fast against a tyrant. It's impossible to fast against General Dyer, who famously massacred led the massacre of people in Amritsar. You know, they do not love me. I do not love them. They regard me as an enemy. But I can fast with someone who, follows me and loves me. And so he really saw it as a kind of way of reforming and challenging the people that were his followers. But he also had to face down many people who were quite popular for prisoners who were engaged in sabotage, had been either indicted or convicted, and for being involved in anti-colonial rebellion. And he would sort of have to do this work of persuading them to stop their hunger strikes, to not do the thing where you're trying to leverage the hunger striking for release or parole or something like that. And he was not always successful, but he was really actively involved. He would always say, like, I know hunger striking because I know protest fasting, I know satyagraha fasting, and he would then deal with that. Well, one of the challenges that he faced and other people in Gandhi's Congress Party faced was when Jitendra Das, who was part of this group that was part of the Lahore conspiracy of 1929, when Jitendra Das was one of the members who actually not only went on hunger strike to the death, that he had been forcibly fed and he had been injured during that time, and he refused any other treatment. He just wanted to be released, and he went and continued his hunger strike. His, I don't know if this will show. Okay. This is actually a video that apparently won't show by what I have here, but it's actually a newsreel that is 1929 from British Pace. You can actually YouTube it, and it's Jitendra Das, and it's actually like the British starting to say, calls it like thousands of hordes of Indians come to pay tribute to the militarized, Jitendra Das, and he goes on this law in Lahore from the prison to the railroad. He's being taken by literally thousands of people following him in a very solemn ceremony. His train then goes to Calcutta, and people are at the different sort of stops, and people are also massing in Calcutta. This procession that occurs, really creates a kind of national martyrdom. He's anointed as the Indian Terence McSweeney. His family receives condolences from McSweeney's widow. So it sort of connects this kind of movement that there's this kind of way. What's interesting about what the Indian nationalists do with this is that they use it as a prelude for a more robust civil disobedience in 1930. But they're already planning on launching a civil disobedience movement, and they use the context of this to bring people together, not to do more hunger striking, but actually to mobilize and protest against the British. This is, an instance of that kind of protest fasting and non-cooperation continuing into U.S. civil rights movements. This is Rose Robinson, and she, along with two other Philadelphians who were very much Gandhian kind of followers and older activists, they return from a trip to Washington. They are not served at a restaurant in Elkton, Maryland, and they refuse to leave. They're being dragged out of the restaurant, and then they refuse to accept the judicial consequences of it and the trial itself, and then they go on hunger strike. They refuse to eat in the prisons, and they talk about that in terms of they were refused being treated as humans and as equals, and so they don't really believe in this justice system, this immoral situation. So the rest of the book sort of looks through these different kinds of democratic upheavals that occur during World War II and afterwards, looking at experiences of the Japanese in U.S. concentration camps in Tule Lake, South African anti-apartheid organizing, Northern Ireland, and Guantanamo, and refugee crises. And so I want to just sort of with the time remaining, I want to just sort of indicate a few different elements of this longer process. So in hunger striking upsets things both on the outside and on the inside. So in Tule Lake, which is a camp in the far northeastern part of California, after martial law is imposed, after a large protest about a labor dispute and an assembly there that was very peaceful, they declared martial law in the camp in 1943, and they began to round up hundreds of young men and boys and put them in a stockade, literally a jail within a jail. It's a makeshift stockade. They keep them there without any idea of what's going on. There's no sort of charges particularly or trial. They're just held in a stockade. 300 men go on hunger strike after a moment where the guards have already confiscated all kinds of food from them. They're supposed to make their own food, so they go on hunger strike for a week. And there are other sort of hunger strikes that occur in Tule Lake, and we don't know much about this historically at the moment until afterwards, because we don't really learn until the stockade is really closed down that it becomes publicized that there was even a stockade, that there were people there hunger striking. And then there were a bunch of different diaries that emerged from there that I did research on. We know more about conscientious objectors like Bayard Rustin, who are conscientious objectors in US prisons in Lewisburg in this case, who will go on hunger strike dealing with the fact that he's upset that the cafeteria is segregated, and he wants to change what's happening in the prisons themselves. So he and various others go on hunger strike in these different kinds of instances. In Robben Island, as I said, it didn't change. It didn't require that people had to know outside what was going on. It changed something in the prison. There were ANC prisoners and PAC prisoners that were rivals in anti-apartheid organizing, and they were at odds with each other until there was a shortage of food, and they started giving no rations to the African prisoners, but giving some to the colored and Indian ones, and everyone refused to eat. The prisoners on the ground refused to eat. Mandela and others that were the leaders didn't know about it for several days, but this goes on for a while. It causes all kinds of upheaval in the prison, including the white guards that are there also don't feel like they're being treated very well, so they go on strike. And it creates all these different kinds of conditions. But what people talk about with that Robben Island strike is that it changed the conditions of people within the prison, that they felt like they were actually, after the hunger strike and whatever concessions they got, that they were able to engage in politics in prison, that they were able to find ways of connecting and being community. So the hunger strikes that I was involved in witnessing were ones which in South Africa were emerging, and the reason there were like 27 or 28 documented hunger strikes that occurred before the January 1989 one that leads to this sort of steamrolling. One thing that was important is that the hunger strikes themselves move from detention center to detention center. So people are striking not just in one prison, but more in this kind of snowball way. It's also occurring at a time when there's a real way in which there's all kinds of communication networks, as I said, that are developed between UDF and other organizations. A range of solidarity movements occur. There's a ramping up of different kinds of attention. So these strikes continue in South Africa beyond this initial moment, but it produces this kind of wave when the strikes themselves, these major strikes, overwhelm the prison authorities. They have to send people to hospitals. It's because they have to send them to public hospitals. At the hospitals, the doctors and the nurses refuse to forcibly feed them or treat the prisoners as anything but patients. And that leads to a way in which the system itself is overwhelmed. It's also overwhelmed by the fact that there are different forms of political solidarity that emerge among people who didn't feel like they were actually as able or possible to be actively engaged in protesting. They can do vigils, they can do other kinds of support, because a lot of the churches and the mosques were actually involved in a lot of these different kinds of struggles. And in fact, there was a lot of attention paid to religious leaders as they were communicating with detainees and trying to help solve and change problems. Hunger strikes massify in different ways, and Tiananmen Square is a really important example of this. We know Tiananmen Square maybe in a lot of different ways, but in the middle of that struggle, there were 1,000 students that went on hunger strike for a week. And that actually brought out more and more rallies of people massifying in other cities outside of Beijing, so that it really produced a kind of expansion of the idea of public protest fasting on the outside. And this is, 1989 in May, and even though as we know, even after initial negotiation, which was done by the leaders of the time because they were worried about a Russian state visit, a Soviet state visit that was happening at the time, Russian state visit that was happening at the time, the sort of legacy of this kind of continues on in different ways. And I've often wondered in 1990s, where hunger striking was used by students on campuses for Chicano studies, for Asian American studies, for a lot of other different kinds of projects, as well as for, people would reference Cesar Chavez, they would reference Gandhi, but it was also clear that there was also this kind of, anti-apartheid movement organizing. There was organizing about like what was happening in terms of democracy struggles in China that were also informing different ways in which people were using and mobilizing these kinds of struggles. And up till today, around Gaza, in Yale, at Princeton, I'm not sure if anything happened here at Penn, but there were hunger strikes alongside some of the encampment struggles in different ways. And climate starvation strikes. So these are all the ways in which the public protest fast has been kind of growing in understanding and in usage. But the immigrant rights activities have been also happening in a variety of different ways. And I think it's important because I think we're actually at that historical moment where we're going to be looking at this one more again in different ways. The process of, it's only since the 1980s that Australia, the United States, and the European nations redirected their powers of punitive caging to deter unauthorized immigrants from Asia, Africa, Caribbean, Central, and South America, all previously orbits of imperial conquest, colonization, and conflict. Despite, and in fact, probably because of international accords to protect and process seekers of refuge, it's really important that the US and Australia actually enact their refugee systems around the same time, mostly geared towards Southeast Asians, Cambodians, Vietnamese, Laotians. They begin to also do this work of incarcerating in the US, Haitians in the 1980s and 1990s, in the 1990s and 2000s, Cambodians, Chinese, Somalis, Afghanis in Australia, and Iranians as well. The states become committed to securitizing their borders, plunging refuge seekers into conditions of rightlessness, and trapping them in dehumanizing indefinite detention. From 2012 to 2022, there were a range of different hunger strikes that occurred in detention of Haitians, of Central Americans, Afghanis, Iranians, Cambodians, Somalis, Tamil Sri Lankans, Sikhs, Punjabis, Bengalis. It was just like it was happening as the avenues for release from detention became narrower and narrower. Hunger striking became a means to illustrate how detention itself was causing crisis, not just for individuals, but also for families. People were also being put into deportation proceedings, and that was also amplifying this. The US and other immigration and refugee law communities had historically supported family reunification. So it was interesting that and important that claiming kinship became a very important way in which people were articulating forms of solidarity and struggle, making visible the crisis of what detention policies had to do, and also the networks that came together were university legal clinics, human rights lawyers, ethnic organizations, Quakers, Catholics, Muslims, Jewish, Sikh social service organizations. They're mobilizing in different ways to create a kind of human connection between US citizens and those holding immigrant status, humanizing the plight of what's happening with these struggles in different ways. But also, I think, making a claim for another moment, another society, talking about the supports that were created in communities after World War II and that grew in the 70s to 90s to create temporary support within communities for those that are seeking asylum. So one thing that became so important for me in this project was really trying to understand how people are seizing the moment and communicating it. And I think it's really important for us to understand that the strikers' instigation of a hunger strike is related to the witnesses and proximity and a remove, who seize the form, carry it, reshape it in many different ways, across many different media, and rematerialize it outside the prison. The hunger strike form is shaped by all sorts of creators, journalists and lawyers, artists, sympathizers, activists, political allies, critics, physicians, nurses, state authorities themselves. What is vital in engaging and explaining the hunger strike is the ways that it can be grasped and responded with both feeling and reason. Naming the phenomena hunger strike puts it into focus for people who may puzzle over behavior they observe before deciding how to respond. And the most consistent and persuasive forms of hunger strike are laced with individual heroic stories that convey personal experiences of agony. Drawing on and deploying personal story and context evokes so many questions. Whose dignity is valued and whose is under siege? Who possesses moral force to shame the state? Who lacks credibility, leverage upon the state and society? What strategies are necessary to amass leverage when one has little or none? The strikers themselves are deploying their bodies, but there are also others that are deploying them for forms of empathy, and it's in the crowd that the pictures of Alexei Navalny here, it's people who are staging themselves in the costuming of what they wore in prison, like Lisa Branham, who's in a prison uniform on a train tour in 1919, or people who are in the orange jumpsuits signifying Guantanamo. They're bringing the prison outside, and they're speaking of the experience or what they imagine the experience in prison is to be, and what the struggle for why people are doing this extreme form of protest. This picketing, the public procession, the placards, the banners, the shouts and excitable speech are all those rallying points, and they are also what's photographed, what's videotaped, what circulates in a variety of different ways. And these aesthetics of protests are really significant about understanding what hunger striking is and how it evolves. In Iran, amongst all the different kinds of protests in the Jin Jihad Azadi movement, are the kind of hunger strikes that have been going on, in this case of Narjis Mohammadi. And we see in this kind of struggle a way of trying to connect individually and successively with these particular individuals. I want to say at the end of this that hunger strikes are survivors. They are people who are intent on surviving the hunger strike because death was averted through negotiation, intervention, a ceasing or turning away from the strike. Some of them still die in incarceration, like Navalny, but they didn't die on hunger strike. They resumed eating after weeks or months of starvation. They endured in prison. Many were eventually released. Some of them used their release as a validation of the justice of their cause. Many continued to fight and to work and see a future different from the one they experienced. A hunger striker's struggle is centered on not how long or at what cost she or he can endure, but whether she or he can force society to listen. They nurture hope that it's possible to breach the barriers of incarceration or of their particular condition and reach people that may not already agree with them. This confidence in the powers of communication, that their words and actions could influence others to respond, to meet their demands, and to allow them to set aside their suffering, is what's central to this kind of struggle. They have certitude in a variety of ways in their memoirs and what they recollect and how they share their story, that they know their own mind and they can reach another's conscious. Hungering there is converting that sense of personal agony into a social agony that's communally felt, imagined, and experienced. It's this process that they use to make this kind of protest evolve. And it seems like these protests will continue as long as we see these kinds of forms of experiences of injustice continue, and the ways in which there seem to be no other way out of a hearing, a reception. Many of these situations are ones in which legal proceedings, if they exist at all, have been corrupted and don't allow for a full airing of grievances or any other opportunity. So with that, I conclude my talk and look forward to your comments and questions.
Take this microphone.
Yeah, sure.
We have time for questions, comments.
Thank you.
They can hear you better if you use the mic.
Okay, thank you. Hi, can you talk a bit about the physiological and mental effects of people who participate in these hunger strikes, as well as like the horror, struggles, temptations, traumas that these people themselves embody by like forcefully not eating? And what do kind of like these public displays of trauma signify about the governmental consumption of like suffering and pain? And what constitutes the end of a hunger strike, as in what constitutes its political efficacy when the subjects themselves decide to eat again and to keep living, thus not dying from starvation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, wow, that's a lot of good questions.
Sorry.
No. I think that they're all great. They're all really important. So, first, let me sort of talk a little bit about the physical and mental sort of process. So, in a number of these narratives of hunger strikers, more of which are in the book, people talk about how difficult the first 3 days are. How that's when the pangs of hunger, the feeling of hunger, the doubt, the fear is really at a really heightened level. That, and for anyone has done fasting for, half a day or a day or two, knows that it's sort of like you're constantly kind of bargaining with what your impulses are and feelings. So people speak about doubt and despair like coming in earlier rather than later, meaning that they earlier first, like in the second, third day, about like, what's happening around me. A sensitivity to noise becomes really increasingly acute over time. Many describe after 3 or 4 days losing that feeling of hunger, and other feelings sort of emerge about what's happening to your body, about your fatigue or a headache or a kind of persistent sense of nausea. People have discovered and tested that actually taking water with salt and with lemon might actually reduce the nausea, as well as provide you with some degree of sustenance. So there's a lot of different kinds of experimenting going on there. When hunger strikes go on for a week or two, there's definitely deteriorations that are occurring of the body. What's so striking is I do believe that prison authorities were actually keeping track of these things, but even up through the early 80s and how many hunger strikes that occurred in Ireland, Northern Ireland in particular, they said after Bobby Sands and the other 9 died, that they didn't really know about what changes were occurring in the body around what would happen to someone who refused to eat for 6, 8, 12, 14 days, 3 weeks before. And in South Africa, they ended up doing these studies in these hospitals of people getting back to gradual refeeding. The only studies that were there that people talked about were the starvation experiments in Minnesota, which literally people on a reduced diet and then saw what was happening to them physically and mentally over the course of 9 months to a year, in which a number of people, became acutely depressed and angry. So what is interesting is that people talk about a calm emerging over a longer period of time. So I've grappled with this question around what is victory in a hunger strike? What is the solution? And who gets to decide? And I think it's an interesting problem. It's one that people are often bargaining for particular things in the conditions in which they're being treated. And so they might, as well as a larger overarching goal, which might be release, which might be something about their political demands and stuff like that. But what people often get is something in between, right? And they often get something closer to their demands. But there's the kind of idea, and I think if you sort of follow the idea of like, people want to be listened and heard. So that might actually do well with the way in which they might see, like, this is a victory on a longer journey. I'm able to set aside my suffering, having done this, having also done great damage perhaps to my body and to my experiences of digestion for a long period to come, as well as because I feel like I can do that. So I think I feel like that's the question you're asking about in the end of your set of questions. And I also think it's really important to understand that there are journalists and commentators, there are political authorities, there are activists who all make decisions about whether this was victory or this was, you gave up too fast. And I just don't know if that's really fair. It's what people are going to do. We know people are going to do it, right? We're seeing right now people doing it in terms of election and its aftermath. People trying to make sense of things, right? But what's also really striking to me is if I looked at a longer view, there were larger struggles that take years and decades, right? And people are on that journey. And I think sort of feeling like you're on that journey and you can set aside your particular agony, at that moment and resume eating is something that's important to appreciate and also to wonder what threshold of our expectations and judgments on about change. Yeah.
It's really lovely to have you here, and I'm a historian and newish faculty member in the Department of History here. I want to ask you two questions. One is about looking back, one is about looking forward, and they're more questions that are meant to be reflective.
Mm-hmm.
So, when this book came out, it was amazing to read it with some of your other works and to think back on it.
Yeah.
And could I ask you, instead of giving a genealogy to this specific book, can I ask you to kind of give us a larger arc? Because I feel like from, Contagious Divides to Stranger Intimacy to this book, there's questions of the body, there's questions of intimacy, there's questions of state power. And I kind of want to just hear from you as a scholar, like where
right.
you see yourself and how your development has occurred over time. And then the other one is looking forward. You kind of already opened us up to this, which is the whole time I was sitting here listening to this, as another person who works on immigration, was, there's kind of a way in which the visibility of the body and experience becomes very important to the way in which hunger strikes are politicized, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you have these suffragettes who come out and they talk about their experience, like while they were imprisoned, right? And then the example that you gave of the kabai at Tule Lake, right?
Yeah.
But there's a way in which I think state formations are happening now where that visibility is less accessible, and that there's also this question about removal, right? And the removal of like the physical body from a certain space so people don't have access to information, particularly when we're talking about deportation, right?
Yeah.
And that visibility is kind of fading in some ways, especially when you're kind of eliminating due process and other kinds of factors where even the possibility of detention is up for grabs, right? So as someone who's worked on these questions for a long time, can I ask you to meditate on these questions?
Yeah, and I think a longer conversation will ensue, I know, about this, but thank you for the opportunity of saying that. I'm obviously, when you think retrospectively of what pulls together the work that you've done over time, I think you're right. Like there's a concentration on different ways of seeing, practicing, using the body in relationship to both state power and to cultural forms. And I think that that's been really an important element of the work that I've been exploring in a variety of different ways. So, Contagious Divides was about epidemics and about how Chinese and Chinatown is perceived. So it's both about body and space. And it's also about like how that circulates, not using a particular lens of medical authority and public health state practices, but also looking at like, why do labor movements pick up on this? Why do white women's social welfare movements work on it? Why is it that disease becomes the conduit by which, or the possibility of disease and environmental conditions becomes the conduit by which Chinese Americans are making claim to public housing resources and to health resources that they've been denied. So it's seeing it as like a kind of orbit that's circulating where people are sort of resourcing, both representing and resourcing the bodies. Stranger Intimacy was really about trying to understand the different ways in which bodily intimacy between people of different kinds and different ways is being interpreted legally and socially, using court cases to do an ethnography of a social world in which same-sex interracial sexual activity is occurring at the same time as interracial heterosexual relationships are being navigated, negotiated in a context that's, how people are sort of living in these small, instant towns and cities in the US West that are produced out of intense migration and industrialization of agriculture. And Refusal to Eat really began to, I think I sort of really picked up on the carcerality, and that sort of gets me to the last part of what you were asking about, is really thinking about carcerality, about the idea that is about rendering bodies, confining bodies, not making them visible, making sure that they're outside of reach, removing the problem which is in public and putting it in some place that's sequestered, deeply sequestered. And so I think that kind of attention to visibility has been an interesting problem that I've been trying to work with in terms of how protest movements are mobilizing the body of the person that's incarcerated in a variety of different ways, the name and their circumstances, their condition, their feeling. And authorities are struggling with what to make of the human body and sort of trying to figure out what can the body endure, what it can't endure, speculating about it, using medical science to do that, using disciplinary practices to do it. And at the same time, wondering about whether visibility itself is, what does visibility lead us to do? So, you can sort of see these different kinds of moments, and I'm certainly like, it's a PowerPoint, so gosh, it's like hyper visible sort of manifestations, but it's interesting to understand that visibility becomes the instrument both of, and turning the visible into the invisible becomes the state practice, and only bringing people out in particular ways, and then correspondingly creating these moments where people are asserting their forms of bodily sovereignty as a kind of social and political sovereignty, as a cultural form. I hope that begins to address some of the questions.
Of course.
Yeah,
Thanks.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I think what we might do, if you're okay
Just
with
a
this,
couple
is to
questions,
take
yeah.
a few questions together and then give you the last
Yeah,
word.
sure.
So I saw one more hand.
There were a couple over here. No, really, you had a question.
We'll take several questions at once. Yeah. No, yeah.
Hi,
Hi.
Dr. Shah, thank you for your talk. My question was also kind of related to visibility,
Yeah.
because I see hunger protests as a way of like inverting the structures of power, because prisons or imprisoning someone, especially like public political figures, is like a way to like try and seize or kill the momentum of certain movements. But with like media access, when these figures go on hunger strike, it creates or generates a little bit more publicity sometimes, which can keep the momentum flowing.
Sure.
I'm just curious, like, what were like some instances in which, like, I guess, because media coverage is very important from the prisons themselves, and I'm sure there were like instances of like the police trying to undermine like, media access, but how critical would you say that is to like making sure that these activists and political figures are still able to exert some sort of power and autonomy in like prison state, which is like meant to like.
No, thanks. That's a really great question. Prisons and police authorities are doing everything possible to make sure that things are not in view and visible. So even so, like detention camps, like in Carnes or in others, which there were public spaces where people could actually mill about and go out. When news breaks about a hunger strike and there's a lot of media coverage of that particular place, the outdoor areas become closed off for the people that are actually there. So there's that kind of example of that problem with visibility. Visibility, I mean, certainly with like, and in Guantanamo, we never see what's actually happening there. We just sort of see the ways in which it's been reflected out through these different forms of representations. So I actually think about visibility not in terms of a kind of descriptive action, but rather what is being done in terms of representation to make something visible and grab your attention. Because I think that's the struggle for people who are, say, advocates or journalists even, like what gets your attention? Or do you turn away? Like, so, I gave a similar talk at Yale, and, the people in the audience, of course, many of them sort of spoke about the hunger strike that occurred in the spring there, and, participating in supporting the people that were on hunger strike. There were probably some people that were involved in it as well, in a variety of different ways, how they gave different kinds of support. But they also described all the ways in which people would turn away, would look the other direction, would not want to deal with it, were confronted with something that was, and people would get quite angry, and sometimes would be like literally, in some cases, flinging food at people, or suggesting that they had been, they were eating surreptitiously. So that would like somehow destroy their credibility. But that's a very common sort of set of kind of array of reactions. And what I wanted to sort of appreciate is that hunger striking becomes significant because people are doing all kinds of reactions to it in a way that some of them are sympathetic, some of them are curious, some of them are angry, some are hostile, some are repudiating what they see. And that it's drawing more and more people into this press-up of like, what is going on here, or what does this have to say to us about our current moment or society or condition? I believe that there are lots of instances where people will just, I'll end with this one last thought here. I remember when Bobby Sands and many of the other men were on hunger strike, because the Catholic school was right next to, the Catholic school and the Catholic church was right next to my middle school. And I remember people talking about it. I remember parents talking about it. What they talked about was, it's just wrong for them to die like this. It's wrong for this to happen. What about their mothers? What about their families? And so what they weren't necessarily supporting the particular prisoners or what in their particular condition, but they were supporting the condition by which they had become so acutely vulnerable and that they were dying. And this is what drew their attention and sympathy, and it created a kind of interest for people who may have had great ambivalence about what was going on, and even had great ambivalence about thinking of this in terms of, and wanting to debate in their own minds, is this suicide, is this not suicide? And so something that was something very important morally, ethically, for a number of Catholic people that I knew, this was something that was contradicting that, and they would have to make sense of it. Just like the people at the time in 1980s and earlier were trying to make sense of, is this suicide? Is this a self-destruction that's being willed that is against what we believe in? Or is this about a struggle with authority that refuses to listen to you and refuses to care for you? And it's a deeply complex paradox. I think that what kept me going with this project was just sort of attending to the paradox of it again and again, and trying to extend my own empathy and vision about why people are doing this and why it matters and why is it persistent and why I fear it will continue as long as we have these kind of conditions of carcerality and equity persist, because it's not the first thing people do, it's often the last thing that they try after a long different kinds of struggle and petitioning that occurs. Thank you.
On that note, please join me in thanking.
Right on. I'm from LA.
You're from LA?
Yeah.
Cool.
My whole family's US.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you still drink them?
Because they're all